Let's get started on part 3 of module 14, installing VMware vSphere components. We have already covered installing the hypervisor on an ESXi host and installing the vSphere client and installing vCenter server. In this section we will discuss deploying the vCenter Server Appliance, and we will discuss what it means to boot from a storage area network. But before we do that, let's just do a little review of Lesson 1 and Lesson 2. Let's review installing the ESXi host and the vSphere client. 3 steps. Download the installation disks, install the ESXi host, and install the vSphere client. The installation disks we are going to download are the ESXi installer disk and the vCenter installer disk. We download the ISOs and we burn the ISOs to DVDs. We go to VMware's website, we go to vSphere and select Download Free Trial, and create an account, scroll down alphabetically, and select ESXi, followed by download, and we download the ISO for ESXi. We download it. Then we go back to vCenter server, and we download that. And we download the ISO for vCenter server. We download that. Then we burn the ISOs to DVDs, and now we have our hypervisor DVD and our vCenter server, which is also a vCenter client installer disk. To install the hypervisor on the ESXi host, just like installing an operating system on any computer, you install the disk in the DVD reader and you boot to the DVD. You might be installing on a large data center server, or you might be installing on a small server. If it's your first install, it'll probably be on a small server. In either case, make sure that the hardware is compatible with VMware by checking with the VMware compatibility guide. So you boot to the DVD, machine boots to the DVD, and it takes us straight to the installer, and we select ESXi Standard Installer. We press the Enter key, and then it loads the installation program. And then it says, "Welcome to the ESXi installation." Press Enter to continue. We press Enter to continue. For the licensing agreement, we press F11 to accept the licensing agreement. We select the hard disk where we're going to install the hypervisor. I only have one hard disk in this machine, so that's easy. I press Enter. I specify the administrator password, the root password. Root is the administrator. Don't forget that. Press Enter to continue, and then it proceeds to install the operating system into the hard disk of the host. And once it's done installing, it says installation has successfully been completed. Take out the DVD and press Enter to reboot. So I take out the DVD, press Enter to reboot. The machine reboots, and it boots up to ESXi, and we're just about done the installation. The only thing we have to do is press F2 and then type in the administrator name and the password. All we have to do is assign an IP address. We select Configure Network Management, select IP address. All we have to do is assign an IP address, subnet mask, and a default gateway, just the way we would assign TCP/IP to any other computer. Followed by Enter. Escape to continue, and that's all we really need to do to configure the ESXi host. It's a simple install. You boot to the DVD, accept the licensing agreement, assign it a password, reboot, and give it an IP address. And then after you're done installing the ESXi host, then you install the vSphere client. vSphere client runs on your workstation and it's used to remotely configure the ESXi host. So you insert the vCenter DVD in the DVD drive of your workstation and you run the install program. The vCenter server installer, we select the vSphere client followed by install. Select the language. Welcome to the vSphere client installer. I install it in the C drive. Copies the files. And now the vSphere client has been installed. And then there's the shortcut which goes to the vSphere client. So I click on the shortcut to the vSphere client. I type in the IP address of the ESXi host that I want to connect to, the administrator name which is root, and the administrator password, followed by log on. And now I am connected to the ESXi host, and now I can create virtual machines on that ESXi host. So what we did was we installed the hypervisor on the ESXi host, we installed the vSphere client on the workstation, and then we connected to the ESXi host using the vSphere client. And then to review installing vCenter server, whereas the vSphere client, you have to log on to each individual ESXi host one at a time with a separate administrator name and password for each one. The vCenter server, it allows you to connect to many ESXi hosts with one single logon, and it allows you to manage many ESXi hosts. It can be installed on a Windows server or on a Linux server. Two ways to go: on a separate physical server or on a virtual machine. The vCenter server can be installed on Windows server which is on a separate physical server, or it can be installed on a Windows server which is installed on a virtual machine on an ESXi host. And this is a little tricky to understand. You can install vCenter server on a Windows server which is running on a virtual machine which is running on an ESXi host, and this is us over here at the workstation remotely configuring the whole thing. This is the method which is typically used. So to install vCenter server, first create a virtual machine, install a guest operating system, Windows 2008 server, install VMware tools, and then once you have a virtual machine with Windows running on it, then you install vCenter server. You take the second disk which you downloaded and installed, and you go to the virtual machine which you created and put in the vCenter server install disk, and it runs auto run. And then you select vCenter installer. And there are really three things that you install: single sign-on, the inventory service, and the vCenter server service. When you select simple install, it takes you through all three of these: single sign-on, inventory service, and vCenter server. So we will select install, and it says, welcome to the Install Shield wizard for the vCenter single sign-on. We select next to install single sign-on. We accept the licensing agreement. We type in the password that we are assigning to this single sign-on, followed by next. We install a local Microsoft SQL Server 2008 Express, followed by next. We enter the database administrator password and the database user password, followed by Next. Then we type in the IP address of the Windows server that the vCenter server is being installed on, the machine that we just created and installed, followed by next. It will be installed to the C drive. We select next. It'll use port 7444, so you might want to keep that port open on your firewall, followed by next. We click on install, and it proceeds to copy the files for vCenter single sign-on that allows us to have only a single password and username that connects us to all of the ESXi hosts at one time. And single sign-on is almost done, and then when it's done, then it goes straight into the second phase, which is the inventory service. And of course, the inventory service is where all configuration variables are stored. It's kind of like the registry. So we select the inventory service, and we install the inventory service. And then after the inventory service is installed, it goes straight to the third step, which is the installation of the vCenter server. We install vCenter server. We will type in the license key later, followed by next. We will install Microsoft SQL Server Express instance for small deployments, followed by next. We will use the system account, meaning the administrator account from the Windows server that we are installing vCenter server on. This is the IP address of that server, followed by next. These are the ports that will be used, so make sure that these ports are open on the firewall, followed by next. We will select inventory size of small, less than 100 hosts, or less than 1,000 virtual machines, followed by next. Click on install, and it copies the files for vCenter server. And vCenter server is installed, and then it shows that three things were installed: single sign-on, which is real important, inventory service, and vCenter server. And then after installing vCenter server, we connect to it using the vSphere client and create a data center, add an ESXi host. We click on the vSphere client, and we type in the IP address of the server the vCenter server is installed on, not the IP address of the ESXi host. And then we type the administrator name, which is not root, it's administrator, because it's the administrator name of the administrator of the Windows server, followed by the password. Click on log on, and this connects us to the vCenter server, and we see we can search the inventory, look at hosts and clusters, VMs and templates, data store clusters, and networks. If we click on hosts and clusters, there's our vCenter server, and it says the first thing that we should do is to create a data center. So to create a data center, we right click on vCenter server and select new data center. Give it a name such as data center 1. After adding the data center, the next thing to do is to add a host. So you right click on the data center, click on add host, type in the IP address of the host that you're going to add, the username of the host, which is root, followed by the password, followed by next. And this shows the virtual machines which are on the ESXi host that we're adding. Now this is a little tricky to understand. The vCenter server virtual machine is on the ESXi host that we are adding to the vCenter server inventory. A little tricky to understand. Click on next. We will add the license key later. Followed by next. We will not enable lockdown mode. Followed by next. We will add it to data center 1. Followed by next. We click on finish, and we can now see that data center 1 has been created, that the ESXi host has been added, and these are the virtual machines that are running on that ESXi host. And we can add additional ESXi hosts. So, installing vCenter Server summary. You connect to the ESXi host using the vSphere client. Then you create a virtual machine on the ESXi host, install Windows Server, VM tools, then you install vCenter Server, which is a three-step process, single sign-on, inventory service, vCenter Server. Then you connect to the vCenter Server using the vSphere client, and you add ESXi hosts. And that was all review. Now let's go to the new material in this section, deploying the vCenter Server Appliance. Typical virtual server setup tasks, as you know, include creating a virtual machine, installing a guest operating system, and installing an application. And that can be time-consuming. One possible solution is to implement a virtual appliance. A virtual appliance is a piece of software that contains a virtual machine, an operating system installed on that virtual machine, an application, and an application installed. And the reason that we do it is for ease of installation. The vCenter Server Virtual Appliance is made up of a virtual machine, an operating system, Linux, and an application, the vCenter Server. And we install it as a single OVF file. It's easy to install. One-step process. First, we download the OVF Open Virtualized Format file, which contains the entire appliance from VMware's website. And then we install it. To install it, we go to the vSphere client and we select File. Under File, we select Deploy OVF Template. Then we browse and we locate the OVF file which we downloaded from VM's website. We click on Next. We can see that the product is the VMware vCenter Server Appliance, followed by Next. The name it will be given is the vCenter Server Appliance, followed by Next. We will thin provision the disk so it doesn't take so much space, followed by Next. Click on Finish. It installs. And once the installation is done, there is the vCenter Server Appliance. I will power it on, and then if we look at the virtual machine console, we can see it's a Linux operating system which is booting. And then it takes us to the configuration screen, and it says to configure the appliance, go to the browser to HTTPS to the IP address of this virtual machine, port number 5480. Port 5480 takes us to the configuration screen for this virtual machine. So we go to our browser, we type in the IP address of the virtual machine followed by port 50:5480, and that takes us to the login screen for the vCenter Server Appliance so we can configure it. We type in the username, which is root, and log on. Most importantly, under vCenter Server Service, we click on Start. When we get to the VMware vCenter Server Appliance, there are a couple things we have to do. Of course, accept the end user licensing agreement, and then select the embedded database, or Oracle, if we like. Then we, most importantly, start the vCenter Server Service. Of course, we could configure the password, configure authentication to be integrated with Active Directory, reconfigure the IP address, or configure updates. After we have started the vCenter Server Service, then we can connect to the vCenter Server Appliance using the vSphere client. And you will see when we connect to the vCenter Server Appliance, it doesn't look any different from when we install it under a Windows server. We go to the vSphere client, and we type in the IP address of the virtual machine, followed by log on, and it takes us to the vCenter server. It looks just like it did when it was installed on the Windows server. The first thing to do is to create a data center, so we would right click, select New Data Center, give it a name such as Data Center 1. And then we would add a host and add virtual machines. vCenter Server provides centralized host management, and the vCenter Server Virtual Appliance is made up of a virtual machine, operating system, Linux, and an application, the vCenter Server, as it is installed as a single .ovf open virtualization format file. And then the last thing we have to cover is booting an ESXi host from a storage area network. Now let's review. We will review what it means to boot a computer, what's a PXE boot, what it means to boot an ESXi host, and then we'll look at what you mean by booting from a storage area network. Now we all know what it means to boot a computer. It means to turn it on. When you boot a computer, the operating system is pulled off of the hard disk and loaded into the RAM of the computer. That's the definition of booting. The operating system is pulled off of the hard disk, loaded into the RAM of the computer. Now a PXE boot. PXE stands for Pre-Boot Execution. A PXE network interface card is a network interface card that allows this computer to boot not from the hard disk which is in the computer, but to boot from the hard disk of a computer which it accesses over the network. A PXE network card boots from a hard disk which is on a server across the network, and it's often used with workstation installation software. PXE means an over-the-network boot. We're still in review mode here. And then booting an ESXi host. When you boot an ESXi host, the hypervisor is pulled off of the hard disk and loaded into the RAM of the host. The hypervisor is pulled off of the hard disk and loaded into the RAM of the host. Now, let's move on to what you mean by booting an ESXi host from a SAN. And really, it's just another method of a PXE boot. The ESXi host is connected to a storage area network, and the hypervisor is located on a disk in the disk array. And booting the ESXi host from a storage area network is where the hypervisor is pulled off of the hard disk in the disk array and loaded into the memory of the ESXi host. That way we don't have to have any hard disks in the ESXi hosts. Booting an ESXi host from a SAN, we have the hypervisor is stored on the disk array, and the hypervisor is stored on a separate logical unit number, that is to say separate from the virtual machine file system. The host has a PXE capable network interface card. Any new computer would. The PXE card pulls the hypervisor from the logical unit number on the disk array, loads it in the memory of the ESXi host, and that's what it means to boot an ESXi host from a storage area network. Could be a fiber channel storage area network, or it even works with a slower iSCSI storage area network. So in summary, we've reviewed the installation of the hypervisor on the ESXi host, the installation of the vSphere client, and the installation of the vCenter server. Then we looked at deploying the vCenter Server Appliance, and we looked at booting an ESXi host from a storage area network. This concludes Part 3 of Module 14, installing VMware vSphere components. Thank you very much,